at the edge of two continents, where the Bosphorus cuts a silver line between Europe and Asia. A nation once written off as the sick man of Europe is rewriting the rules of 21st century power. For decades, the world watched Turkey as a bridge, a NATO outpost, a candidate forever waiting at the gates of the European Union, a country defined by what it was between rather than what it could become. But bridges, if built well enough, learn to hold weight of their own. Today, Turkish-made drones patrol skies from Libya to Nagorno-Karabakh. Turkish diplomats broker grain deals between warring superpowers. Turkish soap operas outdraw Hollywood in living rooms from Santiago to Jakarta. And a single Turkish decision can tip the balance inside NATO itself. How did a country battered by coups, currency collapses, and a century of identity crisis claw its way toward the top table of global power? The answer is not a single dramatic turn. It is a century of quiet accumulation, sudden ruptures, and one unrelenting question that has haunted Ankara since the fall of the Ottomans. Does Turkey belong to the East, the West, or does something entirely its own? What follows is the story of how that question became Turkey's greatest strategic weapon. For 600 years, the word empire and the word Turkey were nearly synonymous. From the fall of Constantinople in 1453 to the trenches of the First World War, the Ottoman state stretched across 3 continents, governing Arabs, Balkan Slavs, Armenians, Kurds, Greeks, and countless others under a single sultan in Istanbul. But by 1918, that empire lay in ruins. Defeated alongside Germany and Austria-Hungary, carved up by the victorious allies at Sevres, stripped of Arabia, the Levant, and North Africa, the Ottoman heartland itself faced partition. Greek troops occupied Smyrna. French forces held the south. British warships anchored in the Bosphorus. It seemed, in 1920, that Turkey itself might cease to exist as an independent state. It did not. A career army officer named Mustafa Kemal, who had distinguished himself defending Gallipoli against British and Anzac forces in 1915, refused to accept the partition. From the interior Anatolian town of Ankara, he organized a nationalist resistance, first against the occupying powers and then against the Sultan's own government, which he viewed as a puppet of foreign interests. The War of Independence that followed, fought between 1919 and 1923, pushed Greek forces out of Anatolia, forced the Allies to renegotiate, and culminated in the Treaty of Lausanne, which recognized a new, sovereign Turkish state within borders the nationalists themselves had drawn. On October 29, 1923, the Republic of Turkey was declared, with Ankara as its capital and Mustafa Kemal, soon to take the surname Atatürk, father of the Turks, as its first president. What Atatürk built in the following 15 years was less a continuation of empire than a deliberate rupture from it. The Caliphate, the spiritual office that had bound the Ottoman Sultan to the wider Islamic world, was abolished in 1924. Islamic law courts were replaced with a civil code adapted from Switzerland. The Arabic script was discarded for a Latin alphabet. Western dress was mandated for officials. Women were granted the right to vote and stand for office years before many European states extended the same right. Atatürk's vision was unambiguous. Turkey's future lay in aligning itself with the industrial, secular civilization of Western Europe, even as its population, geography, and cultural memory remained deeply rooted in the Islamic and Ottoman past. This tension between a secular Western-facing state apparatus and a population whose identity ran through mosque, empire, and tradition would not resolve. It would instead become the defining fault line of Turkish politics for the next century, resurfacing in every subsequent decade under different names and different leaders. Atatürk died in 1938, a year before the outbreak of the Second World War, and his successor, İsmet İnönü, managed something remarkable. Turkey remained neutral through nearly the entire conflict, only declaring war on Germany in the final months, largely as a formality to secure a seat at the post-war table. Neutrality preserved Turkish infrastructure and manpower, but also left Turkey isolated and vulnerable as the Cold War's battle lines hardened. The Soviet Union, emerging as the dominant power in Eastern Europe, made territorial demands on Turkey's eastern provinces and sought joint control over the Turkish Straits, the Bosphorus and Dardanelles, the only maritime passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. For Ankara, Soviet pressure was existential. For Washington, it was an opportunity. In 1947, President Harry Truman announced what became known as the Truman Doctrine, pledging American support to Greece and Turkey against the spread of Soviet influence, arguably the opening act of the entire Cold War. Turkey received American economic and military aid under the Marshall Plan framework, and in 1950, in a decision that would define its Cold War identity, Ankara sent troops to fight alongside American and United Nations forces in the Korean War. The Turkish brigade fought with distinction and suffered heavy casualties at battles like Kanuri, a sacrifice that Ankara leveraged directly into NATO membership. In 1952, Turkey and Greece joined the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and Turkey instantly became the alliance's most exposed frontier state, sharing a long land border with the Soviet Union and controlling the strategic choke point of the Turkish Straits. American nuclear-capable Jupiter missiles were stationed on Turkish soil by 1961, missiles that would become a secret bargaining chip in the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis the following year, quietly withdrawn in exchange for the Soviet removal of missiles from Cuba, a trade Turkey itself was not fully consulted on, a slight Ankara would not forget. Throughout the Cold War, Turkey's value to the West was almost entirely geographic and military. A NATO anchor, a listening post, a buffer against Soviet expansion into the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Domestically, however, the Republic Atatürk had built proved far more fragile than its founders had hoped. The military, which saw itself as the ultimate guardian of Atatürk's secular vision, intervened directly in civilian politics no fewer than 3 times in this period. Coups in 1960, 1971, and 1980, each time citing threats to secular order or political instability, each time reshaping the constitution before eventually returning power to civilians. These interventions left Turkish democracy perpetually provisional, its elected governments operating in the shadow of a military that considered itself, not the ballot box, the final authority on the nation's identity. Economically, Turkey spent much of the 20th century as a modest, state-directed economy, protected by tariffs, dependent on agriculture, and chronically prone to crisis. That began to change in the 1980s under Prime Minister Turgut Özal, who dismantled protectionist barriers, opened Turkey to foreign trade and investment, and pushed the country toward export-led growth. Özal also revived, cautiously, a European ambition. Turkey formally applied for membership in the European Economic Community in 1987. The application would drag on for decades, entangled in disputes over Cyprus, human rights, and a lingering unease among some European leaders about admitting a large, Muslim-majority nation into the European project. Turkey entered a customs union with the EU in 1995 and was formally recognized as a candidate for membership in 1999, yet full accession talks, opened in 2005, would stall repeatedly and, in the years that followed, effectively freeze, leaving Turkey in a permanent antechamber, neither fully inside Europe's institutions nor entirely outside its economic orbit. The 1990s brought a decade of political instability and economic mismanagement, culminating in a catastrophic financial crisis in 2001 that saw the Turkish lira collapse, banks fail, and the economy contract by nearly a tenth in a single year. It was out of this wreckage that a new political force emerged. In 2002, the Justice and Development Party, known by its Turkish acronym AKP, won a landslide election victory. Its leader, a former mayor of Istanbul named Recep Tayyip Erdoğan, had been imprisoned briefly in 1999 for reciting a poem deemed to incite religious hatred, a conviction that had barred him from serving as prime minister until a legal workaround was found in 2003. Erdoğan and the AKP presented themselves as conservative Democrats, rooted in Turkey's Islamic and Anatolian identity, but committed, at least in the movement's early years, to EU accession, economic liberalization, and civilian oversight of the military. The first decade of AKP rule delivered genuine transformation. Inflation, which had run at double and triple digits for years, was brought under control. Turkey's economy, driven by construction, manufacturing, and a burgeoning export sector, grew rapidly, lifting millions out of poverty and creating a new urban middle class loyal to Erdogan's party. Istanbul's skyline filled with new towers. Anatolian cities that had been agricultural backwaters became industrial hubs exporting textiles, appliances, and machinery across Europe, the Gulf, and Africa. The military's traditional dominance over politics was steadily curtailed through a series of trials and constitutional reforms, culminating in reduced institutional power for the general staff. For a period in the mid-2000s, Turkey was frequently cited internationally as a model, a majority Muslim democracy successfully combining economic dynamism, religious conservatism, and NATO membership. But the seeds of a more assertive and more contested Turkey were already visible. Foreign policy under Erdogan's long-serving advisor and later foreign minister and prime minister, Ahmet Davutoglu, was reoriented around a doctrine of strategic depth, the idea that Turkey's Ottoman past was not a liability to be buried, as Atatürk had insisted, but an asset to be reclaimed. Davutoglu argued that Turkey's history, geography, and culture gave it natural influence across the former Ottoman space: the Balkans, the Caucasus, the Middle East, and North Africa. Ankara opened new embassies at a pace unmatched by almost any country in the world, expanded Turkish Airlines into the most extensively connected carrier on Earth, and funded religious and cultural outreach through agencies like the Directorate of Religious Affairs and the Yunus Emre Institute, explicitly modeled on cultural diplomacy tools used by France, Germany, and Britain. Then came the Arab Spring, and with it, the unraveling of the zero problems with neighbors policy Davutoglu had championed. Turkey initially welcomed the uprisings of 2011, positioning itself as a natural ally of newly empowered political Islamist movements across the region. Most visibly the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, whose brief government under Mohammed Morsi Ankara backed enthusiastically, only to watch it toppled by a military coup in 2013 that Erdogan denounced in uncompromising terms. In Syria, Turkey's relationship with President Bashar al-Assad, once cultivated through personal diplomacy and family vacations between the two leaders, collapsed entirely as Assad's brutal suppression of protests spiraled into full civil war. Ankara became one of the principal backers of Syrian opposition forces, opened its border to millions of refugees. Turkey would eventually host more displaced Syrians than any other country on earth, and found itself drawn ever deeper into a war on its own southern frontier, one that entangled Kurdish militias, Islamic State fighters, Russian air power, and American special forces in a single volatile theater. It was in this crucible of regional chaos that Turkey's 21st century identity as a hard power began to take shape. The Syrian war exposed the limits of relying on Western allies whose interests did not always align with Ankara's. Most acutely over American support for Kurdish militias in northern Syria that Turkey considered indistinguishable from the Kurdistan Workers' Party. The PKK, a group Ankara, Washington, and the European Union all designate as a terrorist organization, and which has waged an insurgency inside Turkey itself since 1984 that has cost tens of thousands of lives. Turkey launched a series of direct military incursions into northern Syria between 2016 and 2019, Operations Euphrates Shield, Olive Branch, and Peace Spring, aimed at pushing back both Islamic State remnants and Kurdish-led forces along its border, actions that drew condemnation from human rights organizations and uneasy silence from Western allies unwilling to fully confront a NATO member. Domestically, this period of external turbulence coincided with the most serious internal crisis of Erdogan's rule. On the night of July 15, 2016, factions within the Turkish military attempted a coup, commandeering tanks, jets, and state broadcasters in an effort to seize power. The attempt collapsed within hours, defeated by loyalist forces, police, and remarkably, by ordinary citizens who took to the streets in defiance of tanks after Erdogan, appearing via a video call broadcast on a smartphone held up to a television camera, urged the public to resist. Over 250 people were killed. The government blamed the coup on followers of Fethullah Gulen, an Islamic cleric and former Erdogan ally living in self-imposed exile in the United States, whose movement Ankara subsequently designated a terrorist organization. The aftermath was sweeping. Tens of thousands of soldiers, judges, teachers, and civil servants were dismissed or detained in a purge that human rights groups characterized as disproportionate and, in many cases, targeting critics unconnected to the coup itself, while the government maintained the measures were a necessary response to an existential threat to the state. A subsequent referendum in 2017 narrowly approved constitutional changes that abolished the office of prime minister and concentrated executive authority in a strengthened presidency, a system its supporters argued brought long-needed decisiveness and stability, and critics argued eroded institutional checks that had underpinned Turkish democracy since Atatürk. Out of this crucible of coup, purge, and constitutional overhaul emerged a Turkey newly determined to secure its own strategic autonomy. And nowhere was this more visible than in its defense industry. For decades, Turkey had been heavily dependent on imported weapons systems, chiefly from the United States and European NATO allies, a dependency that came with political strings and occasional embargoes, most painfully during the Cyprus crisis of the 1970s when Washington cut off arms sales in response to the Turkish invasion of the island. Determined never again to be so exposed, successive Turkish governments invested heavily in indigenous defense manufacturing. The most visible fruit of that investment was the Bayraktar TB2, an armed drone developed by a Turkish company with deep ties to Erdogan's own family, whose son-in-law Selçuk Bayraktar led its engineering team. Relatively inexpensive compared to American or Israeli equivalents, the TB2 proved devastatingly effective in a string of conflicts, supporting the government of national accord in Libya's civil war in 2019 and 2020, tipping the battlefield decisively in Azerbaijan's favor during the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war against Armenian forces, and drawing global attention once again in 2022 when Ukrainian forces used Turkish drones against invading Russian columns, inspiring a folk song and a wave of viral internet memes celebrating the aircraft. Turkey rapidly became one of the world's largest drone exporters, selling systems to dozens of countries and demonstrating that a middle power could leapfrog into a niche of military technology where it could genuinely compete with, and in some respects outpace, far larger defense industries. This new hard power was matched by an increasingly assertive maritime and energy posture. Turkey clashed repeatedly with Greece and Cyprus over competing claims to gas exploration rights in the eastern Mediterranean, deploying its own drilling and survey vessels escorted by naval warships into contested waters, prompting sharp protests from Athens, Nicosia, and Brussels, and occasional direct naval standoffs. Ankara advanced a maritime boundary doctrine it calls Blue Homeland, asserting expansive claims over surrounding seas that neighboring states and much of the international legal community dispute. At the same time, Turkey positioned itself as an indispensable energy transit hub, hosting pipelines carrying oil and gas from the Caspian Basin and, controversially, expanding energy cooperation with Russia, even as Ankara supplied weapons to Ukraine, a dual-track relationship epitomized by the Turk Stream pipeline and the Akuyu nuclear power plant, a project built, owned, and operated by Russia's Rosatom on Turkish soil. That dual-track diplomacy became Turkey's signature on the global stage after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. As a NATO member, Turkey supplied Ukraine with the very drones that helped blunt Russia's initial advance, and it invoked the Montreux Convention, the 1936 treaty granting Turkey control over the Bosphorus and Dardanelles, to close the straits to additional warships from both belligerents, a move that materially constrained Russian naval reinforcement in the Black Sea. Yet Ankara refused to join Western sanctions against Moscow, continued to purchase Russian energy, and positioned itself as an indispensable mediator, hosting talks between Russian and Ukrainian delegations and brokering alongside the United Nations. The Black Sea Grain Initiative that allowed Ukrainian grain exports to resume amid the war, easing a global food price crisis that had hit developing nations hardest. Few other governments on Earth could simultaneously arm one side of a major war, refuse to sanction the other, and be trusted by both to broker deals between them. A diplomatic balancing act that some analysts describe as principled strategic autonomy and others describe as opportunistic hedging, but which unmistakably demonstrated Turkish leverage. That leverage was demonstrated again inside NATO itself. When Sweden and Finland applied for NATO membership in 2022 in response to the Russian invasion, Turkey, alone among the alliance's members, withheld its approval for well over a year, citing the two Nordic states' treatment of individuals Ankara considers linked to the PKK and to the Gulen movement, and separately pressing for the lifting of American restrictions on F-16 fighter jet sales to Turkey. Finland was admitted in 2023 after Turkish ratification. Sweden's accession was held up considerably longer, finally cleared by the Turkish parliament in early 2024, only after intense diplomatic pressure and, reportedly, quiet linkage to the eventual approval of the F-16 sale by the United States Congress. The episode was a stark illustration that in a NATO alliance requiring unanimous consent, a determined middle power sitting astride Europe's southeastern flank could, for a time, hold the entire alliance's expansion hostage to its own bilateral grievances. Turkey's ambitions have not been confined to its immediate neighborhood or to hard power alone. Turkish construction firms became some of the most active in the world, building airports, stadiums, hospitals, and highways across sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, and the Balkans, often financed through Turkish state credit lines that came with fewer political conditions than Western development aid. Turkish Airlines expanded its route network to more countries than any other airline on the planet, turning Istanbul's new, sprawling airport, opened in 2019, into one of the busiest aviation hubs in the world and a genuine rival to Dubai, Doha, and Frankfurt as a global connecting point between Europe, Asia, and Africa. Turkish soft power extended into popular culture as well. Turkish television dramas, lush, melodramatic serials produced in Istanbul became a genuine export phenomenon, dubbed into dozens of languages and watched by tens of millions of viewers across Latin America, the Balkans, the Middle East, and Central Asia, giving Turkey a cultural reach that rivaled, and in some markets exceeded, that of American or Korean entertainment industries. State broadcaster TRT expanded its international arm, TRT World, explicitly to project Turkish narratives into global media conversations long dominated by Western outlets. None of this ascent has come without cost or contradiction. Turkey's economy, despite genuine achievements in manufacturing and exports, has been rocked by repeated currency crises, with the lira losing the overwhelming majority of its value against the dollar over the past decade and inflation, at its peak in 2022, exceeding 80% annually. A crisis widely attributed by independent economists to Erdogan's unconventional insistence on cutting interest rates to fight inflation rather than raising them, a policy reversed only after his re-election in 2023 under a new economic team. Press freedom and judicial independence have deteriorated sharply according to international watchdogs, with Turkey ranking among the world's leading jailers of journalists in several recent years, a record the government disputes as politically motivated criticism from actors hostile to Turkish sovereignty. The Kurdish question remains unresolved, with periods of peace negotiation giving way repeatedly to renewed conflict, most recently accompanied by cross-border operations into Iraq and Syria against Kurdish militant strongholds. And Turkey's relationship with the European Union, having drifted from active accession negotiations toward a more transactional arrangement centered on migration control and trade, illustrates the degree to which Ankara's Western integration project of the Atatürk and Özal eras has given way to something more independent, more improvisational, and less bound to any single bloc's rules. What emerges from his century-long arc is not a simple story of rise or triumph, but of a nation that has learned to convert its unresolved contradictions into strategic assets. Positioned at the hinge between Europe and Asia, between NATO and Russia, between secularism and religious identity, between Western alliance and Ottoman memory, Turkey has stopped treating that in-betweenness as a problem to be solved and started treating it as a source of leverage no other state can easily replicate. It can sell drones to Kyiv and buy gas from Moscow. It can host Hamas political leaders and maintain formal diplomatic and trade relations with Israel. It can block NATO's expansion for over a year and remain, by nearly every serious accounting, indispensable to the alliance's southern flank. Whether this model constitutes a durable path to genuine global power status or a high-wire act vulnerable to economic shock, political overreach, or the eventual need to choose sides more definitively, remains one of the most closely watched open questions in contemporary geopolitics. What is no longer in question is whether Turkey matters. From the factories producing the drones reshaping modern battlefields, to the straits controlling access to the Black Sea, to the negotiating table where rival powers still need Ankara in the room, Turkey has made itself, deliberately and unmistakably, a country the rest of the world can no longer afford to overlook.